My name is Rachel, and for 18 years I thought love meant never saying no. I was still half asleep when Daniel walked into our bedroom, phone in one hand, coffee in the other, like he was about to read me a weather forecast. I had a surgical brace wrapped around my lower back. There was still a bruise on my hand from the 4-needle. 4 days earlier, a surgeon had gone into my spine and put a rod where 2 of my discs used to be. My whole family's coming this weekend, he said, not even looking up. All 12 of them. 2 weeks. Get the house ready. I laughed, thinking it was a joke. Then I saw his face. Daniel, I had major surgery 4 days ago. Can we push this back even a week? Nobody's waiting on you. Just get it done. Something in my stomach went cold. 18 years of marriage, and he'd never spoken to me like an employee whose request had been denied. I didn't argue. I've never argued well in the moment. I need time alone to think, so I just nodded, and he left, already texting his mother. That night, lying awake with my back throbbing, I finally let myself think back over everything instead of just living through it. Every summer, without exception, Daniel's family descended like a cheerful invasion. His parents, Frank and Barbara, married 49 years with opinions about everything. His brother Mark, who liked to call this the family house after his 3rd beer, as if that weren't a quiet erasure of whose name was on the deed. Mark's wife and teenagers, Daniel's sister, her husband, their toddler. 12 people, 2 weeks, every summer, for 18 years. I bought the specific groceries, made the beds, did the laundry, drove to the airport, planned every meal, smiled in photos always slightly outside the frame. Not once had anyone asked if I was tired. I thought about our daughter Emma, at college, and the promise I'd made myself in the recovery room, that this surgery would finally force me to protect myself. I set the pain pills back down, unopened. I wanted my head clear. Instead, I opened the folder with the deed to our house. My parents bought this house in 1997. I grew up in it. When my father died, and my mother 2 years later, the house came to me, not to me and Daniel. Just me. He'd never once asked to see the deed. Somewhere in the quiet grammar of marriage, my house had become our house, and he apparently felt entitled to open it to 12 relatives without asking me first. Sole owner. My name only, beneath my father's signature and the notary's seal. Sitting on the bathroom floor at 1 a.m., I felt something settle. Not anger, clarity. The next morning I called Patricia Hayes, the attorney who'd handled my parents' estate. I told her everything, the surgery, the relatives, Daniel's flat refusal to postpone. Whose name is on the deed? She asked. Mine. Just mine. Then you have full authority over who occupies that property. You're not asking permission, Rachel. You're informing him. She reminded me I wasn't obligated to host anyone while recovering, that setting a boundary wasn't cruelty, it was the bare minimum of taking care of myself. I wrote that down and stuck it to my laptop. I wasn't plotting revenge, I want to be honest about that. I was tired, scared of my own body's limits for maybe the first time in my life, and slowly realizing the house my father left me didn't have to be a place where I disappeared into service every summer. I opened a fresh document. Not a grocery list. A plan. By Thursday I'd made 3 calls from my car in the pharmacy lot, so Daniel wouldn't overhear. The first was to a restoration company for a full interior assessment, flooring, paint, drywall on a hallway water stain I'd meant to fix for 2 years. All true. A 3-person crew could start Saturday, 2 weeks of work. The second call was to an HVAC company for the rattling central air, also genuinely broken. The third was to a painting company with a standard occupancy clause, no residents on the premises during interior painting and floor work, for liability. That clause was the whole point. My insurance confirmed I qualified for short-term recovery housing, a rehab apartment with grab bars and twice-weekly nurse visits. Daniel had never asked where I planned to actually recover while hosting 12 people, so I never mentioned it. I packed Friday night while he was at his brother's, left a note on the counter, gone to recovery housing per doctor's orders. House is closed for scheduled renovation. Contractors have keys. Please don't interfere, it's a liability issue with the insurance, and drove myself to the rehab apartment. I slept better than I had in 5 days. Saturday morning, 3 SUVs pulled into the driveway around 10, packed with suitcases and coolers. 12 people spilled onto the lawn, and found 2 laminated signs taped to the front door, home closed for renovation. No occupancy until further notice, per contractor and insurance requirements. Behind the windows, a crew was already sanding the hallway floor, plastic sheeting over the furniture, the smell of primer drifting through a screen door. Daniel later admitted he'd tried, uselessly, to pry open. He stood on the porch, Barbara said, for a very long time, just staring at the sign. The foreman explained, politely but firmly, that the property was under an active service contract. Nothing personal. Just the terms of the agreement. Daniel called 4 times before I turned my phone on. When I finally answered, his voice was sharp. What did you do? Exactly what my surgeon asked. I told you I needed you to postpone, and you told me nobody was waiting. Silence, then he hung up. Barbara called next, furious, calling me selfish, catching herself mid-word. I didn't argue with her. Arguing with Barbara was like holding water. The tighter you gripped, the faster it slipped through. I texted her a photo of my discharge paperwork instead. No lifting over 10 pounds. No standing longer than 15 minutes. Minimum 4 weeks recovery. This is why. I hope you all find comfortable arrangements. Then I turned my phone face down and didn't look again that day. Frank left a booming voicemail about how I'd humiliated the family. I deleted it and found my hands weren't even shaking. Daniel, meanwhile, was living a crisis I'd managed quietly for 18 summers without him ever noticing the machinery behind it. Every hotel near us was booked for a wedding, so he ended up paying nearly $4,000 for 2 weeks at the Marriott. He was the one now negotiating what a family of 12 wanted for dinner, driving his parents to the pharmacy, driving bored teenagers to the outlet mall, fielding a dozen small requests that used to simply resolve themselves, because I had always resolved them first. I spent my days at the rehab apartment doing physical therapy, icing my back, reading a novel I hadn't had quiet enough to finish in 8 months. By day 3, I felt something close to peace, guilt-free for once. By day 5, Daniel's texts shifted from all-caps accusations to flat, tired lines, long day. Mom wants steak, Dad says no red meat. Can't win. I didn't respond to either. I'd stopped believing it was my job to always have the answer. Emma called, laughing, saying Barbara had asked her to talk some sense into me, and she'd told her grandmother to talk some sense into herself. It was the first real laugh I'd had in a week. On day 6, Daniel called sounding worn down. The kids are cranky. Mom's complaining about pillows. Dad wants to stay at Mark's, but Mark's house isn't big enough for 4 people, let alone 12. But somehow ours always was. He stopped himself, surprised he'd said it aloud. I didn't realize how much he didn't finish. I didn't finish it for him. That was the moment I opened the spreadsheet I'd kept for years, started innocently, tracking our household budget when Emma was small, but slowly logging the summer visits too, groceries spiking every visit, the July utility bills, replaced air mattresses, the guest mattress bought for Frank's back, the rental car covered the year Mark's transmission failed, 3 years of airfare quietly paid for Frank and Barbara. I added it all up at that small kitchen table. $142,650, over 18 years. I didn't cry. I felt something colder and clearer, the same precision, I imagine, a surgeon feels studying an X-ray. Nobody had ever asked what it cost me. Nobody had asked, in 18 years, if I was tired, or well, or wanted a summer that didn't revolve around service. I spent my last days preparing something I'd never made before, a presentation about my own marriage. I titled the cover page 18 Years of Hospitality, the total printed beneath it, followed by year-by-year breakdowns, circled utility spikes, scanned receipts, photographs of Barbara in my kitchen and Frank asleep in the recliner I'd bought for his back. Undeniable. I called Daniel and asked him to gather everyone that evening. The crew had finished 2 days early, floors gleaming, the water stain gone, the air conditioning finally quiet. I arrived still moving carefully and found all 12 of them in the living room, smelling of fresh paint. I could see the assumption on their faces, that I'd come to apologize, to cry, to be folded back into my old role. Barbara even stood, arms half raised for an embrace. I didn't sit down. I handed out the folders in silence, then stood by the fireplace, the same spot I'd stood in 100 holiday photos, always just outside the frame, and let them read. Can anyone name one vacation, I said quietly, where I was treated like a guest instead of the maid? Can anyone remember asking whether I was healthy enough, or rested enough, or simply willing, before inviting yourselves into my home for 2 weeks every summer, for 18 years? Nobody answered. Daniel stared at his folder, and for the first time I saw something on his face that wasn't defensiveness. Recognition. I'm not asking for the money back, I said. I'm not interested in being repaid. I needed to see it written down to believe it myself. I looked at Barbara. I have loved having this family in my life. I have never once loved being invisible in my own house. Frank cleared his throat and said nothing. Mark's ears went red. Barbara sat back down slowly, looking, for the first time since I'd known her, like a woman confronting an accounting she hadn't expected to face. I didn't wait for an apology. I gathered my things and drove back to the rehab apartment for one more night. I moved home 11 days later, into rooms that smelled of fresh paint instead of chaos. Daniel and I didn't have one big dramatic conversation. Real repair, I've learned, happens in 100 small adjustments. A few days later, over coffee gone cold, he said, I didn't know it added up to that much. I never had to know. You always just handled it. I know, I said, gently, honestly. Those 2 weeks were awful, he admitted, with a tired laugh. But I understand now. I actually understand. We agreed, no more open-door policy, no more assuming the house belonged to whoever wanted it. Future visits would need mutual agreement, advance notice, and guests who helped instead of expected. 6 weeks later, at a smaller, properly arranged dinner, Frank complimented the renovated hallway stiffly, and Barbara brought a casserole, something she'd never done in 18 years. When Mark called uninvited, I heard Daniel tell him, firmly, not this time. You'll need to plan it in advance, same as anyone else. He glanced at me, checking if he'd said it right. I nodded. Later, Frank paused at the door and said gruffly, house looks good. The floor. Not an apology. But something. A few nights later I overheard Daniel on the phone with his father. Dad, this is Rachel's home too. It was her home before it was ever mine. I should have remembered that years ago, and I didn't. That's on me, not her. I'm not arguing about it anymore. That's just how it's going to be. I stood in the doorway with a dish towel, listening to my husband defend me for what might have been the first time in our marriage. Months passed. Autumn came. My back healed, the brace long packed away. One October evening, Barbara called, her voice small and tentative. Rachel, would Saturday be a good time to visit, just for the afternoon? I'd call ahead and bring lunch if that's all right. It wasn't an apology. Barbara would probably never manage those words. But it was something I'd waited 18 years to hear, a woman who once treated my home as a birthright, now gently asking if she might be allowed to knock. Saturday would be lovely, Barbara, I said. I'll see you then. If you've ever felt invisible in your own home, if you've given so much of yourself that people forgot to ask whether you had anything left to give, I hope this reminds you, it's never too late to be seen.